Like giant exclamation marks, skyscrapers punctuate the story of our urban development.
People always want to reach. There's something heavenly about it, and people have wanted to race for height forever.
Developed by the pioneers of architecture in the late 19th century.
They were, at the time, the equivalent of our going to the moon.
These magnificently designed tower giants urbanized some of the greatest cities in the world.
It's about defying gravity and leaving a sign of humanity.
From Chicago to London, from Tokyo to Dubai, skyscrapers have and continue to define our contemporary way of life. In past decades, the tallest buildings were designed to reflect a city's sense of place. But today, a new breed has emerged across the globe, partially due to the evolution of the skyscraper's form and advancements in modern technology.
If you'd predicted tall buildings of significant height and quantity 30 years ago, you'd have said three things with certainty. You'd say, building will be in the USA, there'll be an office building, and it'll be built out of steel. And now the exact opposite is true. The chances are that the world's tallest buildings will be located in Asia. They will probably be mixed use or maybe even residential function rather than pure office. And the chances are they'll be built out of concrete or composite construction.
As we see European cities, they already have a history of tall buildings, making more and more new tall buildings like London or Milan in Italy.
Experts predict that by 2050, more than 2/3 of the global population will live in cities.
So we've seen a huge explosion of tall buildings all around the world.
It is a global building typology. There's no question about it.
From the Far East to the Wild West, from the Nordic North to the sunny South, urbanization is on the rise, and skylines are rapidly changing. In Australia, residents in larger cities are opting for a more affordable apartment-based lifestyle. A surprising change in such a large country.
If we go back half a century, living in a high-rise near the city centre was seen as low-cost living or kind of social housing. This has dramatically changed now. Australia, like many countries, is experiencing a dramatic population boom. So we are looking at mid-rise and a high-rise residential as an important part of the future city to generate density, to generate activity.
As people down under downsized, residential towers soared skyward in the country's cultural capital, Melbourne.
It was the culture of a concrete tall building. It is the city that developed the jump form idea, the self-climbing formwork.
Upon its completion in 2006, Eureka Tower was the tallest residential building in the world, with 556 apartments, a restaurant, and state-of-the-art observation deck.
It was the first building that was so slender to require a liquid mass damper at the top in order to stabilize it.
So that's the tuned liquid damper is usually you put some liquid, maybe it could be a water tank or something like that, okay, on the top, so that if there is a storm, high wind or something, the sloshing of the water back and forth creates the same effect, when the building moves. So when the building wants to go this way, the big mass wants to hold back because of its inertia.
Measuring in at 975 feet tall, Eureka became a hotspot to take in an uninterrupted view of the city.
There's this whole kind of like sub-design sort of industry of taking older buildings and redoing the viewing experience to make it more thrilling.
It's no longer enough to dine in a revolving restaurant or view an expansive skyline through rooftop binoculars. Today's buildings offer tourist attractions and experiences of a lifetime.
Yeah, it makes a ton of money. People will always pay, particularly when they're visiting a city for the first time. There's not much you have to do to maintain it. The building's built. All you have to do is run the elevator. You know what I mean? It's a bit of a cash cow.
For whatever reason, the human brain is programmed to enjoy looking out the wide open vistas.
People love that feeling of being that tall, and they like that feeling of being kind of scared, right?
I always think about what would the world look like if humans inherently had a fear of heights. We could never have skyscrapers.
Observation decks on skyscrapers have become an urban playground for adrenaline junkies, and their stairwells, a vertical racetrack where competitors always come out on top. There's no denying that with each passing decade, skyscrapers continue to evolve in function and form. Yet there's a complicated relationship between the economy and the skyscraper industry. This was never more evident than in 2008, when a global financial crisis brought the tall building industry to its knees, and Dubai was caught in the line of fire. As the city-state's economy hit a wall, construction was stopped in its tracks.
It really affected Dubai for 2 or 3 years, and it was pretty devastating. There was a huge amount of rebuilding internally, economically, to see how that was going to go forward, in terms of how Dubai was actually going to survive that.
So we did see a kind of not a pause, but we saw a leveling out of what was being developed for a number of years.
State-led development, political stability, and strategic marketing helped Dubai turn its economic status around. But the same cannot be said for other design projects underway in America, most notably the Chicago Spire, which had to abruptly stop construction due to a lack of cash flow. But there were a few success stories out of Chicago during the recession, including the lakeside stunner Aqua, architect Jeannie Gang's 82-story mixed-use vertical village.
The Aqua Tower, designed by Studio Gang, is one of the most interesting tall buildings in Chicago, in my opinion. From afar, it looks like a simple rectilinear box, but as you get closer, you start to see where the innovation comes in the tower, and that's from its undulating balconies. These seem random, but there's actually a lot of intelligence behind where these balconies protrude.
Its unconventional design wouldn't be possible without its creative use of modern technology.
The use of computer parametric modeling was used, such that the balconies are designed to protrude outwards where the views are greatest between buildings as kind of strategic views, and are pulled in where there's no need for views or where there's no need for shading. What you end up with is a complexity, a parametric kind of topography on the building that looks random, it looks fascinating, it looks innovative, but that it really talks to its context in an abstract kind of way.
To comply with Chicago's building code, a quarter of the site needed to feature open green space. But Gang doubled that, convincing her corporate clients to put people before profit. With the rise of residential buildings like the Aqua Tower, it was becoming apparent that in order to stay in the skyscraper game, developers would not only need to cater to their investors, but also to the needs of their potential new residents. Across the world in the mid-2000s, people began to give up their suburban homes and move into the city. Unfortunately, the change of scenery brought with it new environmental concerns. Now more than ever, people were beginning to question whether city living was worth putting their health at risk.
What percentage of the world's population right now is dying from chronic diseases? About 75% of the world's population. What we need to do next is to improve on these tall buildings to make the habitats better for humanity.
The health and well-being connection of people with the skyscrapers are very important.
How do we make it better? Part of that is integrating the anthropogenic environment with nature to create this habitat where human and nature will thrive together in an urban environment so we can live long and prosper.
The body goes through changes of breathing, air, pollution, light. So all our physiological and psychological experiences combines our experience of living in a skyscraper.
And the amount that we get from electric lighting by itself is not enough. You have some architects who are keenly aware of that, and they are designing buildings to facilitate that contact between sunlight and the building occupants.
The drive from our perspective is to allow people the breathing space. So in terms of external space, in terms of green space, which the pressure is on terms of developers to allow that to happen, because the pressures of building high is immense.
As a result, architects were creating skyscrapers which considered not just function and form, but also environmental well-being. But designing buildings that consider their surroundings isn't easy on the cheap. In order to build smart, you also need a lucrative budget. In 2008, the financial crisis sent the global economy into a tailspin. But while some countries were struggling, others were able to see themselves out of the darkness. China's growth slowed considerably, but their economy remained stable due in part to the countermeasures taken by its government.
In the United States, the 1920 census showed that for the first time in American history, half the country lived in cities and half the country lived in the rural areas. In a way, China is doing today something similar to what we did in the 1920s.
Stimulus policies and packages were used to mitigate the impact of the crisis, ensuring stability in the tall building sector.
All the major cities or development cities in China are moving to the west, and the city need modernization in the city. They will need these new projects to be in their cities.
Amidst the chaos, Shanghai emerged as a global capital of commerce and culture, emphatically staking their claim with the Shanghai World Financial Center, a 101-story monolith on Century Avenue in Pudong.
The Shanghai World Financial Center was designed at a time there weren't many skyscrapers in Shanghai, which was really only 20 years ago.
Even with a clean slate to work from, the design team was vigilant in ensuring that their building would fit in.
Tall buildings should never be in isolation. There must be a dialogue. So in this case, the only thing we could speak to was this other structure, which is this Pearl Oriental TV tower, which sits on the river in Shanghai. You get the sphere of the Pearl Tower, and then you get the Shanghai Financial Center, which had an aperture at the top, which was a circle. And the idea is you get solid, void, same geometry, looking directly at each other. Then the city around it could kind of develop. So it was a brilliant strategy, absolutely brilliant.
Brilliant, but not entirely sensitive to local sentiment.
Because the developer of that project was Japanese, and iconography is so important to the Chinese, they saw the circle as the symbol of the Japanese flag. At a certain point, we realized we just couldn't build that original design.
In an effort to mitigate the situation and not draw the attention of the internet, developers decided it was better to play it safe than sorry.
This was a time when the internet was coming online in China. Here you get, a communist country that its people are suddenly enabled by the internet to voice their opinions. In this case, the government, the developer, the architect had to respond to that voice. So Bill decided to change the design from the pure circle to this current form, which sort of is, we call it an inverted trapezoid. That dialogue with the Pearl Tower is still there. So you still get the idea that this building is looking somewhere, which I find fantastic.
The building was named the Best Skyscraper of the Year by the Council of Tall Buildings and Urban Habitat, an international group of architects and engineers who praised the center not only for its simplicity of form, but also its innovative structural design. Steel trusses were used to counter typhoon winds and earthquakes, while the columns of the megastructure were a mix of structural steel and reinforced concrete.
So a composite building is one that incorporates structural steel and concrete into one structural member, whether it's a beam or a column.
And you get the benefits of one and the benefits of the other married together to give you typically smaller intrusions into floor plates.
Concrete is very good in compression. Steel is very good both in compression and tension. When you put these two together, then you can create structural members that are very efficient in terms of strength and in terms of stiffness.
The other great thing that Shanghai Financial Center did was to create spaces in and around the void, which is a huge breakthrough. So you sense this space, right? You are in the building and you see other parts of the building. It triggered something in me to think that the future of buildings has to be something about creating and carving out, these spaces in the air so that we can see each other in and around this space, right? So the building can become a community.
With more and more residential skyscrapers popping up in Shanghai and across the globe, the next challenge for designers was to bring a sense of community to their cities by merging life and work into one building. In the 21st century, the desire for multifunctional living and working space has become a priority. Ironically, these two concepts have not always been synonymous with city living. The same could be said about new college campuses known as vertical universities, an emerging phenomena in overcrowded cities like Tokyo. Home to more than 35 million people, the neon-lit capital of Japan is one of the largest and busiest metropolises on Earth.
When we think of colleges, universities and schools, we think of courtyards, quads. These are typically outdoor spaces or large horizontal spaces.
The site for Mode Gakuen was anything but.
It's a 50-story university building where 3 different faculties are stacked up on top of each other. You've got a technology college, you've got a medical college. And this is an outcome of Tokyo's density. We couldn't accommodate those buildings in 5-story and 10-story buildings. It's inefficient. So in Tokyo, we have to build up.
The design for the building was submitted via a competition. The only condition? The structure could not be rectangular. The winning entry was that of a spectacular cocoon-shaped tower, reaching 669 feet into the sky.
In Mode Gakuen, you have 3 classrooms orientated around central core. The space between those classrooms become mini atriums, and they're the student lounges, the place where students can do group work, where they can interact, the learning landscape of the building. As our cities are getting denser, what we're going to find is traditional horizontal typologies and buildings, schools, colleges, even farms and cemeteries are going to have to start going up to be able to compete to stay in the city.
Of all the cities compelled to adopt this vertical lifestyle, few have done it with as much flair as Singapore. the little island that could.
Singapore has been doing for a decade or more now what other cities are still dreaming about. 80% of people in Singapore live in government-built high-rise housing, like Marina Bay Sands, where you literally have a couple of acre sky park on top of these 3 towers.
To create this extraordinary tri-tower city within a city, architect Moshe Safdie had to invent a cityscape that works on a human scale, despite its dimensions and price tag. And the key to achieving that was connectivity. Inspired by the layout of great ancient cities, Safdie's design reinvents the pedestrian walkway as a center of civic life.
It's about bringing that ground floor up into the sky. It's about creating urban habitat in the sky. Not restricted by a single tower, but actually the entire floor plate between 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 towers and in between.
The idea of a series of tall buildings bound together by a podium structure with a kind of connection to the High Line, a landscape terrace with a series of structures like the culture shed and the vessel that are meant to sort of create a sense of urbanity, albeit at a higher level. But they are really sort of not just these lone buildings. They're actually starting to work together.
Since its humble beginnings in 1885, skyscraper typology has continually evolved in form and in function.
The history of the skyscraper is all about the office building, the place of work. Increasingly, we're seeing our modern relationship with skyscrapers being about housing, a place to live. That's a big challenge.
The reasons that drive that single-family house in the suburb, which are about the garden, the park, the community, you can get that in a tall building, and that's what we're getting in places like Singapore.
Those things make sense for urban populations, and the skyscraper is born of urbanity, and that idea of urbanity can be claimed by the skyscraper.
Can we redefine and reimagine our future cities, taller skyscrapers, and think of them as microcosm of cities?
We need release from the pressure of being in a dense urban environment. And we can put those spaces on the ground, but there's no reason we can't put those spaces up in the air.
We're finding buildings around the world that are incorporating sky gardens, play areas at height, gyms at height, running tracks linking buildings together at height. All these things are happening now. And for me, that's a huge part of the future of the tall building.
It's self-contained, but it's well conceived as a series of different uses that complement each other.
And you get thriving areas and, creation of parks and this kind of thing, which really does give that sense of place and, creates a kind of a mini town or village in its own right.
The success of high-density cities, now and into the future, depends largely on their livability and sustainability. And an important component of this is easy access to public transportation.
And anyone that says that a tall building is a sustainable typology is mistaken. They're not. As a standalone building, they are not more sustainable than a low-rise building. Where they can be sustainable is when they make use of existing infrastructure. Hong Kong does this really well.
I think we admire Hong Kong because of its density, but also its energy efficiency. It's the most fuel-efficient sort of city in the world because everyone takes the metro. And so the kind of proximity of the skyscraper to the rail network enables that density to work without the congestion of cars.
Connectivity was a major consideration for the designers of the International Commerce Center, the tallest building in Hong Kong. The 118-story mixed-use tower rises above a cluster of similar yet significantly smaller structural giants, closing in on the retail and entertainment district of Union Square.
The nodes on this transport system, that's where the dense development takes place, and that's where the values are as well.
In other words, the goal to a mixed-use space is to minimize your footprint and maximize both your structure and your connectivity to the rest of the city.
Mass transit and walkable neighborhoods and high degree of amenities and open space for the sunshine. These are the urban values that the skyscraper can facilitate.
Though certain environmental and economic factors are key to creating a quality high-rise, perhaps the most significant is the shape of the building itself, which in turn undeniably shapes our culture. In the 21st century, as the race for height continued, architects developed more innovative skyscrapers around the world. The competition was fierce, and many great nations stepped up to the plate to influence form, function, and design. But China decided to take a quantum leap sideways. In response to several unique buildings created for the Beijing Olympics, the CCTV headquarters rose into being thanks to its creator, architect Rem Koolhaas.
The CCTV has a sort of a tube structure that provides the superstructure for the building, and there are vertical towers and there are horizontal parts of it.
The building was undoubtedly on the mind of President Xi Jinping when he called for an end to his nation's passion for weird architecture. But others have praised the originality and functionality of Koolhaas's remarkable design.
If you go up and down, that's sort of not creative. But if you sort of go up and over and come down and up and over and you're continuously looping, Winston Churchill said, first we shape the buildings and then the buildings shape us. And so architects like to say that architecture has the capacity to sort of form society, to form culture, to sort of shape individuals and the way they behave.
You are always shaping and changing people's experiences when you're inside it, because you get to play with three-dimensional space. And so as designers, that's what we're really, really interested in.
The daring building is made up of two towers that lean in towards each other, connected at the top and bottom by sharply angled bridges.
It would have been extremely difficult, if not almost impossible, to do a design of a structure like that years ago without the computer technology.
Computers are such an integral part of our everyday lives. It's hard to imagine how we ever functioned without them. They have completely revolutionized the workplace and unleashed an unprecedented sense of freedom among those responsible for building toward the sky.
Computer technology also allows us to generate architectural forms that are very unique and very monumental, very artistic, that we couldn't do before.
We can very quickly define very accurately very complex shapes and forms, and we can communicate them between the architect and the engineer.
30 years ago, extraordinary. We were drawing with pens on mylar film.
10 years back, we're doing two-dimensional drawings and measuring stuff. Now everything is done in 3D, so
the structural system, the pipes, all the pipes and ducts and wires and everything else.
And where the door frames are and where the walls are and where the glass hits, all of that now is done holistically.
Technology has changed how we design. It's changed the pace that we design. It's changed our ability to investigate design.
So in that regard, we've kind of leapfrogged the stages that we had before to develop things faster. Now, unfortunately, you do things faster and then somebody else wants it even faster.
Nowhere was this acceleration of a building's time frame more evident than in the design and construction of the world's supertalls. And the global epicenter for this movement, despite the global financial crisis, was indisputably Dubai.
If you look again now, that rise that we saw before is back.
And now that's kind of being driven more by money and commerce and this belief cities need a skyline, need the world's tallest.
They've deliberately built the tallest buildings in the world as an advertisement for how modern they are, to show that they can.
They started building the tall buildings, and then people came, and then they needed more tall buildings. And it just keeps going and going and going.
With a rapidly growing population, cities like Dubai were faced with an important question. Could they keep up with the overwhelming demand for more skyscrapers without compromising their structural integrity? Although Dubai surely had their eye on the sky, it would soon become apparent that the road to success would not be easy.
Where Dubai was at that time in terms of the sort of the adrenaline rush to advance the city itself, that feeling of part of that drive and ambition was pretty phenomenal.
The Middle East is a field of dreams for entrepreneurs, engineers, and architects alike, all seduced by the provocative premise, if you build it, they will come. If only the task itself was so simple.
When you build a building in the desert, there's certain things you have to look out for. One is that the concrete doesn't get too hot, because when the concrete cures, it dries off a lot of heat. They have a very, very good concrete technology system in Dubai, and they put shaved ice instead of water into the concrete when they mix it up in order to cool it down so when it comes to the site, it's not too hot.
The bedrock in this part of the world is surprisingly solid, but accessing it is often a challenge.
This is not the sand that we have on the beaches, which is nice and soft and you can move around with your feet. The deeper you go, the more densely compact it becomes, and at some point through the geological process, that sand becomes a rock. The deeper you go, you actually get to a level where you get very appreciable stiffness in the ground.
The climate is another factor that needs careful consideration in the Middle East. How to block and harness energy from the sun.
Understanding how to work with sun, creating shade in the summer months, is very, very important. Because in Dubai, you can illuminate an office space 60% of the year with sunlight, and the rest of the time it might get too hot, and that's when you need to shade down. So it's understanding the dynamics of the sun, playing with the sun is very important.
The final challenge is the ancient mariner's worst nightmare. Water. Water everywhere, nor any drop to drink.
The groundwater is very, very corrosive. It has more salt than seawater, and sulfates try to eat the concrete. And so because of that, it's something called cathodic protection. When metal rusts, it actually creates what's like a battery. And so what we do is we use a sacrificial anode, which actually reverses the electronic flow of the battery so that the rebar doesn't rust. And so we have some sacrificial anodes buried out there that can be changed out over time as necessary. And then we waterproofed the raft or the mat at the bottom so that the water couldn't even get to the surface.
There's always a sort of precociousness at the leading edge of design. As the problems present themselves, they are solved in a clever way.
We see the designs as a form of research. So we'll do that building and then we'll evolve the idea for the next building. And that's just practical. Gravity doesn't change from one place to the next, so why not build on what you've known?
Prepared with a solution for every conceivable problem at hand, there was simply no holding the emirate back. They plucked the coveted crown of world's tallest from the top of Taipei 101, not by a mere foot or two, but by 1,053 feet. That's akin to flying the Burj Al Arab from the mast of Taiwan's tower, using it as a symbolic white flag to signal the ultimate surrender.
The Burj Khalifa came along and it just took every record and title to the nth degree.
Even with a myriad of obstacles to overcome, Dubai had their sights set on reaching unimaginable heights. Just years after a near catastrophic market plunge, Dubai was ready to prove once and for all that they had what it takes to lead the race to the sky. And once completed, the megatall Burj Khalifa helped them do just that. It took the world's most experienced team to build the world's tallest structure, led by architectural firms Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill, and their structural and civil engineering partner, William Baker.
We won the competition with an idea kind of based on the Tower Palace 3, but I wanted to immediately go into the wind tunnel to see how it behaved. And the data came back and it behaved very badly. As an engineer, or anyone in life, when things go bad, the one thing to do is not panic. To make the Burj Khalifa, we actually had to invent a new structural system. We called it a buttressed core. So to keep the building twisting, you want to make an axle in it, something, a torsion box. And so the concrete walls around the central elevators and stairs forms this axle that goes all the way up the building and keeps the building very stiff so it doesn't twist. But in itself, it's too slender to go such great heights. So down each of the wings, we have a series of walls going down the corridor, but then cross walls like the flanges of an I-beam between the demising walls, between the units, so that they buttress the central core. So we call it a buttress core. The core, which takes care of the twist and the central axle of the building, and then the buttresses, the three buttresses that keep it from moving, just like the buttresses of a cathedral.
Reaching out is key to providing more stability for the building. And so those buttresses support the core up to a certain height and give it more strength and stability that you need.
Gone were the days when a building was made taller by the addition of a few stories. This was the architectural equivalent of going to the moon, and making such a giant leap forward required a complete rethink at every stage in the tall building process.
Because the building was so tall, you actually go through different climates. Because the building was under construction, we would go up on the outside of the building, and when you got up to 160 floors, the temperature would drop, the humidity would drop, the air would be more clear, there'd be a nice breeze, and you actually go through a climate change.
The Burj Khalifa cleverly draws in the cooler, less humid air at high altitude through the top of the structure to ventilate the whole building. It also features one of the largest condensation recovery systems in the world. And on certain days, under certain conditions, it casts a shadow on top of the clouds.
It's a hybrid building. It's not an office building or residential building. It's the tallest office building in the world with the tallest residential building in the world with a mosque. So you stack those things up and you get something quite remarkable.
You start realizing what a megatall is and just how substantially larger that is, that it's almost two Willis Towers stacked on top of each other. So the idea that we have come so far so fast is really interesting.
It's entirely aspirational. That is a project that was really sort of saying, we want to make a mark here, we want to differentiate ourselves, we want to claim a certain title.
When the Burj Khalifa opened in 2010, Dubai was in the middle of a real estate slump. Its once bustling luxury apartments and offices lay empty, leaving many to think that Dubai had overreached, that its vision for a high-rise, high-profile future would fade like a desert mirage, bringing an end to their participation in the race to the sky.
One of my favorite phrases is, evolution's not going anywhere and it's never going to get there. That's where there's a sort of aspiration to have a bigger building than the family member down the road. And that just goes on, but it doesn't go anywhere.
You get very caught up in this idea of the biggest, the tallest, the fastest, the first, without necessarily really asking why.
Great freedom brings with it really incredible responsibility. And sometimes when there are no questions, you can do whatever you like.
If you look at some of the architecture in the Middle East, it seems like there weren't enough constraints, that there was just so much of kind of exuberant desire for expression.
I think what they lacked was a strategic plan. So you would get tall buildings just being developed by different developers in different parts of town without a strategic plan for how those tall buildings fitted into the whole real estate of the region.
So we're building icons before infrastructure. That's not a very sustainable way of constructing our future cities.
Building castles in the sky is achievable as long as you can, metaphorically, retrofit their foundations. Once the Middle East learned from the disaster it averted, it was set to emerge even stronger and with a better understanding of what it takes for tall buildings to become truly iconic.
Iconic is a kind of overused word, and in a way one runs a mile from it, because if anybody starts off with the idea we're going to do something iconic, you're dead.
Everybody's got to aspire to making a great building. I mean, that's self-evident. You've got to do the very best building that you can. But to make it iconic, that's for the public. They're the ones who decide if those buildings are important, if they make the right impression.
And if those forces then generate something which becomes, in a way, symbolic of a place and somehow kindles something in a lay reaction, somebody walking along the street and saying, that's different, I like that, then somehow this gets transmitted along to become iconic.
If you get all of those things right, not just some of them, if you have all of them right, then a building can become iconic. Then it will be loved, and then it will become iconic.